A ringing phone at 1 in the morning never brings good news. For a struggling single father drowning in debt, answering a stranger's terrified whisper should have been a mistake, but driving into the dead of night to save a billionaire heiress? That decision changed his entire world forever. The neon numbers on the cheap digital clock read 1:04 a.m. David Lawson sat at his scuffed kitchen table, rubbing a hand calloused by years of mechanic work over his exhausted face. Spread out before him was a mountain of past due notices, medical bills, and a final eviction warning. In the adjacent room, his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, coughed in her sleep, a lingering remnant of a winter cold that David couldn't afford to take to a proper pediatrician. Since his wife passed away 3 years ago, it had just been the two of them against a world that seemed entirely composed of closed doors and shrinking bank accounts. David took a sip of cold, bitter coffee and picked up his pen, trying to figure out which utility he could let slide this month so he could afford Chloe's asthma medication. Then, his cell phone vibrated violently against the wood. He stared at the cracked screen. An unknown number. Nobody called at this hour unless someone was dead, dying, or in jail. Heart pounding, David answered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp so as not to wake his daughter. "Hello? Jonathan?" "Oh, thank God, Jonathan. You have to get here," a woman's voice whispered. She was trembling, the sheer panic vibrating through the receiver. "They cut the landline. The Wi-Fi is dead. They bypassed the perimeter alarms. They're inside the house." David blinked, the exhaustion suddenly burned away by an adrenaline spike. "Ma'am, you have the wrong number." "I'm not." "Jonathan, please, stop playing games." The woman let out a muffled sob, the sound of someone clamping a hand over their own mouth. In the background, David heard a distinct, chilling sound, the heavy, deadened thud of a solid oak door being kicked. "You're the head of my security. You promised this system was impenetrable. They are on the 2nd floor. Please, I'm in the master suite closet. Call the police." David sat up straight. The absolute terror in her voice wasn't a prank. It was raw, visceral, and chillingly real. "Listen to me," David said, his tone shifting into the authoritative, calm register he used to use back in his days as an EMT. "My name is David. You dialed the wrong number, but I am not hanging up. Have you called 911? The cellular service. They're using a jammer." She breathed, her voice barely audible over a second, louder crash. "The call to you barely connected. I think it's dropping. Please, you have to help me. If they find me, they'll kill me. They want the encrypted drives." "Where are you?" David demanded, grabbing a pen and flipping over a final notice from the electric company. 1044 Crestview Estate. "The Palisades," she whispered rapidly. David's blood ran cold. The Palisades was an hour away in good traffic, an ultra-exclusive enclave for tech titans, old money, and billionaires. It was a fortress of a neighborhood. For a crew to breach a house up there, they had to be highly professional, heavily armed, and incredibly dangerous. "I'm calling the police right now on my landline," David said, wedging his cell phone between his ear and shoulder as he reached for the old corded phone on the kitchen wall. "Stay on the line with me. Do not make a sound." "They're in the hallway," she whimpered. "They know I'm in here. Jonathan set me up. He must have. That's why he isn't answering. Oh my God. They're outside the door." The line went dead with a sharp click. David slammed the receiver down, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dialed 911 on the landline, rapidly explaining the situation, the address, and the interrupted phone call to the dispatcher. "We are dispatching units to 1044 Crestview Estate, sir," the operator said, her voice infuriatingly calm. "However, the Palisades gate requires secondary clearance, and we have reports of a felled tree blocking the main access road. It may take units up to 25 minutes to reach the property." 25 minutes. In a home invasion, a victim usually had less than 3 minutes before they were found. David looked at the hallway leading to Chloe's room. He was a single father, He had no business driving toward a hostage situation in a billionaire's mansion. If something happened to him, Chloe would end up in the foster system. It was the ultimate risk. But he kept hearing the woman's voice. "They'll kill me." David dialed the number for Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor who practically lived on a nocturnal schedule and treated Chloe like her own granddaughter. She answered on the second ring. "Martha, it's David. It's an absolute emergency. Can you come sit on the couch?" "Chloe is asleep. I'll be there in 30 seconds, dear," the older woman replied without hesitation. David threw on his heavy canvas jacket, grabbed a heavy steel Maglite flashlight and a solid iron tire iron from his tool bag by the door. By the time Martha slipped into his apartment, clutching her cardigan, David was already out the door. He jumped into his beat-up 2012 Ford F-150. The engine roared to life, fighting the damp chill of the night. He threw it into gear and tore out of the apartment complex, tires squealing against the wet asphalt. He didn't know who this woman was, and he didn't know what he was driving into, but he knew one thing for certain: no one was coming for her in time. The rain began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets as David navigated the winding, treacherous roads of the Palisades. The dispatcher hadn't been lying. A massive pine tree had been deliberately felled across the main entrance road, effectively blocking any police cruisers or fire trucks from getting up the mountain. David didn't stop. He threw the truck into four-wheel drive, hopped the curb, and aggressively navigated the muddy, steep embankment around the tree, his truck sliding dangerously close to the cliff edge before the tires caught traction on the pavement again. He arrived at 1044 Crestview Estate. It wasn't just a house. It was a sprawling, modern, architectural marvel of steel, dark stone, and glass. The imposing iron gates, which should have been locked tight, were slightly ajar. The electronic keypad was smoking, completely melted by some kind of acidic compound. David killed the truck's headlights and engine, coasting the heavy vehicle into the shadows of the manicured oak trees lining the driveway. He stepped out into the pouring rain, the heavy tire iron gripped tightly in his right hand, the unlit Maglite in his left. The front door of the mansion had been breached. The massive mahogany double doors were splintered off their hinges. David slipped inside, the silence of the massive foyer pressing down on him. The house smelled of expensive cedar, ozone, and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. To his left, a security guard lay unconscious on the marble floor, a dart protruding from his neck. They hadn't killed the guard. They were professionals aiming for a specific target. "I'm in the master suite closet," the woman had said. David crept up the floating glass staircase, his boots making no sound. As he reached the second-floor landing, he heard the low, clipped voices of two men. They were speaking in a mix of English and what sounded like Serbian. "The reinforced steel will take another 4 minutes to cut," a rough voice muttered. "Cut faster. The jammer only holds for so long before the failsafe triggers an analog signal to the private security firm," another voice replied. David peered around the corner of the sprawling corridor. At the far end, two men dressed in tactical black gear were focused on a massive, vault-like door inside what looked to be an elegant bedroom suite. Sparks flew in a blinding arc as one of the men operated a high-powered thermal lance against the hinges of the panic room. The woman was trapped inside, and they were seconds away from breaking through. David scanned his surroundings. As a contractor, he intuitively understood the layout of modern smart homes. If this place was heavily reliant on a centralized smart system, cutting the main power wouldn't just turn off the lights. It might reset the magnetic locks or, at the very least, kill the power to the outlets the intruders were using for their heavy equipment. He spotted a utility panel tucked behind a decorative silk tapestry in the hallway. He slid open the panel. It was a secondary breaker box. Without hesitating, David ripped the main switch downward. The mansion plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Down the hall, the thermal lance sputtered and died. The hum of the smart home's central air conditioning vanished. "What the hell happened?" one of the men cursed loudly. "Check the generator." "We disabled the generator, you idiot," the other hissed. "Use your thermals." David didn't give them the chance to adjust. He grabbed a heavy bronze sculpture resting on a pedestal near him and hurled it down the opposite side of the hallway toward a glass display case. Crash. The sound of shattering glass echoed like an explosion in the dark. "Over there!" one of the mercenaries shouted. Footsteps pounded down the hallway away from the master suite, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness in the wrong direction. David moved fast. He slipped into the master bedroom, keeping his back to the wall. He reached the heavy vault door. It was warm to the touch from the thermal lance. He leaned close to the thick steel. "Lady," he whispered fiercely. "It's David, the guy from the phone. The police are blocked by a tree down the mountain. Open the door." For 5 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. David gripped his tire iron, hearing the footsteps of the mercenaries returning. They had realized the broken vase was a diversion. "He's in the master suite," a voice yelled. Suddenly, the heavy vault door clicked, the internal deadbolts sliding back. The heavy door swung open just enough for David to see a pair of terrified, wide eyes in the darkness. He pushed inside, instantly pulling the heavy door shut behind him and slamming the manual deadbolts into place just as a hail of suppressed gunfire hit the exterior of the door. David leaned against the cold steel, gasping for breath. The panic room was small, dimly lit by a battery-powered emergency LED strip. Sitting on the floor, clutching her knees to her chest, was the woman. She was in her early 30s, wearing a silk nightgown, her dark hair a tangled mess around her pale, striking face. Despite the terror in her eyes, there was an unmistakable aura of authority about her. This was Vivienne Lancaster, the billionaire CEO of Lancaster Global Technologies. David had seen her face on the cover of Forbes while waiting in line at the grocery store. Vivienne stared at the soaking wet, broad-shouldered man in a faded flannel shirt and work boots, holding a tire iron. He was bleeding from a shallow cut on his cheek where a branch had whipped him during his drive up the mountain. "You're not Jonathan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, ma'am," David said, wiping a mixture of rain and blood from his forehead. "I told you, I'm David." "You came," she said, seemingly unable to process the reality of it. "You actually came. Why?" Before David could answer, a massive impact rattled the vault door. The mercenaries were trying to attach explosive breaching charges. But then, the distinct, wailing chorus of police sirens pierced the night, growing louder and closer. The Palisades private security, aided by the police who had finally abandoned their cruisers to hike up the hill, were swarming the property. Muffled curses echoed from outside the door, followed by the sound of heavy boots sprinting away. The two of them sat in the dim light of the panic room, listening as the mansion was flooded with tactical teams and shouting officers. Vivienne slowly let go of her knees. She looked up at David, the initial shock wearing off, replaced by a profound, piercing gratitude. "David," she said softly, testing the name on her tongue, "you just saved my life." "Just paying it forward, I guess," David muttered, suddenly feeling very out of place in the high-tech bunker of a billionaire. He just wanted to go home and check on Chloe. But as the police finally knocked on the vault door, announcing their presence, Vivienne reached out and gently grasped David's rough hand. "No," Vivienne said, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "This doesn't end here. You're coming with me." Dawn broke over the Santa Monica Mountains in a wash of bruised purple and slate gray, casting long, harsh shadows across the wreckage of the Crestview estate. The relentless rain had reduced to a miserable drizzle, but the driveway of the mansion was ablaze with the blinding, strobing red and blue lights of half a dozen LAPD cruisers, 2 tactical response vehicles, and an ambulance. David sat heavily on the rear bumper of the ambulance, a thermal shock blanket draped haphazardly over his damp flannel shirt. A paramedic had cleaned the shallow cut on his cheek and slapped a sterile bandage over it, but the adrenaline crash had finally hit him. His hands were shaking slightly, a delayed reaction to the sheer terror of what had transpired inside the glass walls of the mansion. A few yards away, Vivian Lancaster stood surrounded by a phalanx of detectives and federal agents. She had traded her silk nightgown for a borrowed LAPD tactical jacket, but she looked far from a victim. Her posture was rigid, her expression forged from cold steel. The terrified woman in the panic room was gone. The billionaire CEO had returned to the helm. Detective Arthur Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the LAPD's Major Crimes Division, stood before her, flipping through a wet notepad. "Miss Lancaster, we've secured the perimeter. The two suspects who fled the scene evaded our perimeter on foot, likely down the fire roads towards Sunset Boulevard. But we recovered their thermal cutting gear. It's military grade. This wasn't a standard break-in." "Of course it wasn't, Detective," Vivian said, her voice carrying a sharp, commanding edge that made the seasoned cops stand a little straighter. "They bypassed a multi-million-dollar biometric security grid. They knew the layout. They knew the location of the secondary breaker, and they knew exactly where the encrypted servers were hidden. This was an inside job." "You mentioned your head of security, Jonathan Croft," Hayes said, tapping his pen. "We've sent a unit to his residence in Brentwood. It's empty. His passport is missing, and his bank accounts were drained 4 hours ago." Vivian's jaw tightened. "Jonathan has been with my family for 8 years. He had the bypass codes. They were after the prototype schematics for Project Oracle on those drives." She paused, her eyes scanning the chaotic driveway until they landed on David. Her expression softened imperceptibly. If that man hadn't cut the main power and caused a diversion, Jonathan's mercenaries would have breached the vault. Detective Hayes followed her gaze, looking at David with a mixture of profound skepticism and grudging respect. "We took his statement. A wrong number? He drove up here in a 12-year-old pickup truck with a tire iron? It's a miracle he wasn't shot dead in the foyer." "Sometimes, Detective, miracles wear steel-toed boots," Vivian replied quietly. David didn't wait around for the commendations. He watched the detectives swarm the property, the forensics team dusting the splintered mahogany doors, and realized he had no place in this world of corporate espionage, missing passports, and billionaire CEOs. He looked at his cheap digital watch. It was 5:15 a.m. Chloe would be waking up soon. The reality of his own life, the unpaid electric bill, the looming eviction, the cost of his daughter's inhalers came crashing back down, suffocating the brief heroics of the night. While Vivian was pulled away by a severe-looking FBI agent who had just arrived on the scene, David quietly slipped off the ambulance bumper. He tossed the thermal blanket onto a stretcher, kept his head down, and walked past the barricades toward the line of manicured oak trees where his battered Ford F-150 was parked. The engine turned over with a rough, protesting sputter before settling into a familiar rumble. David threw it into gear and carefully navigated around the police cruisers, driving back down. He left the Palisades behind, descending into the smog-choked, concrete sprawl of the San Fernando Valley. By the time he pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of his apartment complex, the sun was fully up. He climbed the concrete stairs to the second floor, his muscles aching with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He unlocked the door to Unit 4B. The apartment was quiet, smelling faintly of stale coffee and pine sol. Martha was dozing in the worn armchair by the television. She blinked awake as the door clicked shut. "David," she whispered, her eyes widening at the bandage on his face and his damp, disheveled clothes. "Good heavens, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Martha," David said, forcing a reassuring smile as he unlaced his boots. "Just a crazy night. Thank you for staying." Chloe didn't stir once, the elderly woman said, gathering her cardigan. She paused at the door, looking at him closely. "You have a good heart, David Lawson. Don't let the world punish you for it." After Martha left, David walked into Chloe's small bedroom. The walls were painted a faded pink, decorated with cheap, peeling stickers of stars and planets. His daughter was sound asleep, her small chest rising and falling rhythmically. David sat on the edge of the mattress, gently brushing a lock of dark hair from her forehead. He had risked making her an orphan last night. The guilt sat heavy in his stomach like a lead weight. He went to the kitchen, stared at the stack of bills, and picked up his pen. The heroics were over. It was time to figure out how to keep the lights on. For 2 days, life returned to its grueling, relentless normal. David picked up extra shifts at the auto garage, coming home with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and his back screaming in pain. The news cycle was dominated by the break-in at the Crestview estate. Pundits on the small television in the garage break room speculated wildly about corporate terrorism targeting Lancaster Global Technologies, but the police kept the details and David's involvement strictly under wraps. On the third evening, the fragile peace shattered. It was raining again, a persistent, cold California drizzle. David was in the kitchen, boiling cheap pasta, while Chloe sat at the small table, drawing with broken crayons. Her cough had returned, a dry, rattling sound that made David's chest tighten with anxiety. He had just decided to sell his grandfather's gold watch, his last possession of any real value, to afford a visit to a private clinic. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed on the apartment door. David froze. It wasn't the tentative tap of his landlord demanding rent, nor was it Martha. He picked up the heavy metal flashlight from the counter, his instincts instantly reverting to the adrenaline-fueled state of the mansion. He walked to the door and peered through the scratched peephole. Standing in the dingy, poorly lit hallway of his apartment complex was Vivienne Lancaster. She wore a tailored black trench coat that probably cost more than David made in a year, and her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. Flanking her were 2 massive men in dark suits, their eyes scanning the peeling paint of the corridor with professional suspicion. David unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Miss Lancaster." "David," Vivienne said, her eyes sweeping over his grease-stained t-shirt and the cramped, bleak apartment behind him. Her gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on the stack of past-due notices on the kitchen table before meeting his eyes. "May I come in?" David hesitated, then stepped aside. "It's not exactly the Palisades." Vivienne gestured for her 2 massive bodyguards to remain in the hallway. She stepped into the apartment, the scent of her expensive, subtle perfume clashing violently with the smell of boiling pasta. "Daddy?" Chloe asked, dropping her blue crayon. She looked up at the strange, beautiful woman with wide, curious eyes. Vivienne's cold, corporate demeanor instantly melted. She offered the little girl a warm, genuine smile. "Hello. You must be Chloe. I'm Vivienne. Your father is a very brave man. He fixes cars," Chloe said proudly, before a harsh fit of coughing overtook her. David quickly poured a glass of water and handed it to his daughter, his face flushing with a mix of protective instinct and deep embarrassment. "Why are you here, Miss Lancaster?" "I gave my statement to Detective Hayes. I left my contact info. I don't want any reward, if that's what this is." Vivienne turned back to David, her expression hardening into something deeply serious. "This isn't a social call, David, and it's not a charity visit. We have a massive problem." She walked over to the small living room area, ignoring the frayed fabric of the cheap sofa, and turned to face him. "Jonathan didn't just sell me out to a rival tech firm. He sold me out to a faction within my own board of directors. Richard Sterling, our majority shareholder, orchestrated the hit. He's been embezzling hundreds of millions through offshore shell companies. The encrypted drives in my panic room contained the proof I was going to hand over to the SEC the next morning." "I don't understand," David said, crossing his arms. "What does corporate embezzlement have to do with me? You're alive. The police have the drives. Sterling goes to jail." "Sterling didn't go to jail," Vivienne corrected, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The drives were secure, yes, but Sterling is a billionaire with deep political ties. He's tying the evidence up in court, claiming the files were fabricated. And the men who attacked my house? The mercenaries? They haven't been caught. David's stomach plummeted. He looked toward the door. When you cut the power to the mansion, the centralized servers initiated an emergency backup dump, Vivienne explained, pulling a glossy photograph from the inner pocket of her trench coat and dropping it onto the kitchen table. Before the cameras went dark, they captured the exterior driveway. David looked at the photo. It was a grainy, green-tinted night vision still captured by a high-end security camera. It showed his beat-up Ford F-150. The license plate was perfectly legible. Through the windshield, David's face was clearly visible, illuminated by the dashboard lights. Jonathan's crew mirrored my security servers before the police arrived, Vivienne said grimly. They know exactly who interrupted their operation. They know who you are, David. They know your address. And more importantly, Sterling knows that you spent 20 minutes alone with me in that vault before the police arrived. He thinks I gave you copies of the files. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the bubbling of the pasta water on the stove. David felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Chloe, who was oblivious to the conversation, happily drawing a lopsided house. A cold, absolute terror gripped his spine, a terror far worse than what he had felt facing the mercenaries in the dark hallway of the mansion. They think a mechanic from the valley has encrypted financial records that can take down a billionaire? David asked, his voice shaking with sudden, suppressed rage. Are you insane? I didn't even know your last name until the cops showed up. I know that, Vivienne said calmly, stepping closer to him. But Sterling is a paranoid, desperate man cornered by federal investigators. He doesn't take chances. He ties up loose ends. And right now, David, you are a loose end. I have to call the police. I need protection for my daughter. The LAPD cannot protect you from Richard Sterling, Vivienne said flatly. A squad car parked outside your apartment complex won't stop a professional hit team. You saw what they did to my house. You saw the military-grade equipment they used. David gripped the edge of the kitchen counter until his knuckles turned white. So, what are you saying? That I ruined my daughter's life because I answered a wrong number? Vivienne reached out, her perfectly manicured hand resting over his rough, calloused one. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I am saying that you saved my life, and I repay my debts. You and Chloe cannot stay here. It isn't safe. I have a secure, fortified compound in Malibu, right off the Pacific Coast Highway. It's guarded by former Navy SEALs who don't answer to Jonathan or the board. You are both coming with me. Tonight. David stared at her, the absurdity and the terrifying reality of the situation warring in his mind. I can't just pack up and leave. I have a job. Chloe has school. I have already bought the auto garage where you work through a proxy holding company. Vivienne interrupted smoothly, her CEO persona operating at full efficiency. You are officially on an indefinite, fully paid leave of absence. I have a private tutor on standby for Chloe, and a world-class pediatrician arriving at the compound tomorrow morning to look at her lungs. David was stunned into silence. He looked at the stack of bills, the peeling paint, and then at his daughter. He had spent years fighting a losing battle against poverty, trying to keep his head above water. Now, in the span of 3 days, his entire world had been violently upended by a wrong number. Pack a bag, David, Vivienne commanded softly, but there was a plea hidden beneath her authority. Please, let me protect you the way you protected me. David looked at the photograph on the table again. He didn't have a choice. He walked over to the kitchen table, picked up the stack of past due notices, and dropped them into the trash can. Chloe, David said, his voice remarkably steady as he turned to his daughter. Grab your favorite toys, sweetie. We're going on a trip. The Malibu compound was less of a house and more of a modern coastal fortress. Suspended over a jagged cliffside overlooking the churning Pacific Ocean, the property was surrounded by a 10-foot concrete perimeter wall and patrolled by armed contractors. For the first time in 3 years, David slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat about his bank balance. By the second morning, Vivienne had made good on her promises. A top-tier pediatric pulmonologist from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center arrived via a private town car to examine Chloe. Within an hour, the doctor had prescribed a specialized, highly effective treatment plan for the little girl's chronic asthma, handing David a 6-month supply of medications that would have cost him a year's salary. Watching his daughter breathe easily, her chest rising and falling without the familiar, terrifying rattle, brought David to his knees. He wept silently in the guest bathroom, washing his face with cold water until the overwhelming wave of relief subsided. But outside the serene, sunlit walls of the guest wing, a vicious corporate war was being waged. Vivienne had transformed the estate's massive home theater into a tactical war room. Whiteboards covered the screens, lined with complex financial webs, wire transfer logs, and photographs of Richard Sterling's associates. She had quietly flown in 3 senior data analysts from Palantir Technologies, a secretive software company renowned for its financial tracking algorithms. They were working around the clock to trace Sterling's embezzled funds. However, they had hit a catastrophic wall. On the 4th afternoon, David walked into the war room carrying a tray of black coffee. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Vivienne stood at the head of a massive oak table, glaring at a charred, partially melted hard drive resting on an anti-static mat. "What do you mean it's unreadable?" Vivienne demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the servers. "Miss Lancaster, the thermal lance used by the mercenaries warped the external casing," the lead analyst explained, adjusting his glasses nervously. "The heat fused the actuator arm to the magnetic platters. If we try to power it up, the reader head will score the disk and permanently destroy the master ledger. The data is there, but the physical mechanism is bricked. We need a specialized micro-robotics lab in Switzerland to separate the platters, and that will take weeks." "We don't have weeks," Vivienne said sharply. "Sterling just filed an emergency injunction to freeze my personal assets and seize the company's servers. In 48 hours, he will use his political leverage to bury this investigation permanently." David set the coffee tray down. He stared at the burnt, warped piece of metal. It wasn't code. It wasn't software. It was just a broken machine. "Let me look at it," David said, quietly. The room fell silent. The lead analyst scoffed. "With all due respect, Mr. Lawson, this is a multi-million-dollar piece of encrypted military-grade hardware, not a carburetor. It's a spinning disk attached to an arm on a pivot," David replied evenly. He walked over to the table and pulled a small, high-powered magnifying loupe from his pocket, a tool he used for inspecting microfractures in fuel injectors. "The principle is the same. It's just mechanical binding." Vivienne looked at him, her intense gaze searching his face. She didn't see a grease monkey. She saw the man who had unflinchingly walked into a dark mansion with a tire iron to save a stranger. "Do it," she ordered the analysts. For the next 3 hours, the war room held its breath. Using microscopic jeweler's tools, a localized heat gun, and a terrifying amount of steady, precise pressure, David worked on the drive. His hands, rough and calloused from years of heavy labor, moved with the delicate, surgical grace of a watchmaker. He isolated the warped actuator arm, applied a micro-drop of industrial solvent to the fused joint, and gently pried the metal away from the fragile magnetic platter. With a soft, metallic click, the arm swung free. "Plug it in," David whispered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. The analyst connected the drive to the terminal. The screen blinked black, then flooded with lines of green code. The ledger was intact. The room erupted into cheers, but Vivienne only looked at David. Armed with the decrypted data, the hammer of justice fell on Richard Sterling with biblical severity. That evening, Sterling was hosting a lavish, black-tie charity gala at his sprawling estate in Beverly Hills, celebrating his impending victory. He was mid-speech, raising a glass of vintage champagne to a crowd of politicians and elites when the grand doors of the ballroom were thrown open. Dozens of federal agents poured into the room, flanked by tactical units. The hard karma was absolute and merciless. Sterling was tackled to the marble floor in his custom tuxedo, his rights read to him in front of his wealthy peers and the flashing cameras of the press. The evidence was irrefutable: money laundering, corporate espionage, and conspiracy. His empire crumbled overnight. His offshore accounts were seized, and his legacy obliterated. Jonathan, the treacherous head of security, didn't fare any better. He was apprehended by Interpol agents at an airport in Dubai, just as he was attempting to board a flight, his stolen millions already frozen. They would both spend the rest of their natural lives in a federal penitentiary. 2 weeks later, the storm had finally passed. The Malibu compound was quiet. The late afternoon sun painted the Pacific Ocean in brilliant shades of gold and amber. David stood on the expansive wooden deck, watching Chloe run along the private beach below. Her laughter floated up on the salty breeze, a sound that healed the deepest parts of his soul. He had his bags packed in the hallway. The danger was gone. It was time to go back to reality. He heard the soft slide of the glass door behind him. Vivian stepped out onto the deck. She had traded her sharp corporate suits for a simple white sundress, her dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders. "Doctor," Heiress said, "Chloe's lung capacity is up by 40%, Vivian said softly, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "I don't know how to repay you, Vivian," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave my daughter her life back." "You saved mine first," she replied, turning to look at him. "And then you saved my legacy. I think the ledger is more than balanced, David." He looked down at his rough hands. "I should be going. The garage is technically mine now, thanks to your proxy company, but I still have a business to run. I need to get Chloe enrolled in school." Vivian reached out, her fingers gently tracing the faded scar on his cheek. "I don't want you to leave," she said, her voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper. "I've spent my entire life building an empire, surrounded by people who only wanted something from me. You are the only person who ever walked into my life just to give, just to protect." David's breath caught in his throat. He looked into her eyes, seeing past the billionaire CEO to the woman who had held his hand in the dark. "Vivian, our worlds are entirely different." "Then let's build a new one," she said fiercely, stepping closer. "Stay, David. Stay forever. Run your garage, let Chloe grow up on this beach, and let me be a part of your family. Please." David looked down at the beach, watching his daughter build a sandcastle. Then he looked back at the incredible woman standing before him. He reached out, pulling Vivian into his arms. "Okay," David whispered into her hair as the sun dipped below the horizon. "We're staying." A wrong number dialed in the dead of night didn't just save a billionaire's life, it forged a family. David Lawson answered a desperate call, risking his own world for a stranger. In return, Vivienne Lancaster gave him a future where his daughter could breathe easy and a profound, unexpected love. Sometimes, the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin in the darkest, most terrifying hours.